I'm Melanie Trailer, and today we have a demo for you about borders. I tend to avoid borders in the majority of my quilt patterns. I'm not much of a fan of them, but there are times when a quilt design just really needs that border or calls for it. So I don't want to just like completely eliminate them. I just prefer not to deal with them. We got honey pie on the wall back here, and it has a border that goes all the way around it. Here's one little thing to think about when you're doing your borders, particularly for brand new quilters, is that if you don't have all your patchwork the right size, your borders are never going to fit. So very important to be using your pressing spray, sewing with your 1/4 inch seam, and pressing nicely. So all of those things can add up to more accuracy, which kind of adds up to you not struggling with borders. And I kind of think that that was the issue for me in the very beginning when I decided I didn't like borders, that I was struggling with my precision. So naturally you struggle with borders. All right, so this demo is for the honey pie quilt, but really you can take everything I'm going to show you today and put it towards any quilt with borders. All right, so I have my borders, and then I have my cornerstones, and these cornerstones are just going, you know, on all 4 corners of the quilt. So that's what I'm working with. And in my patterns, I always kind of write them the same way, where you have all your strips, then you cut the selvage off, and then you sew them all together. But know that everybody doesn't like to sew all the strips together, and everybody doesn't have a 36-inch cutting mat to work with. So the smaller your cutting mat, the harder sewing all of these strips together will be. But what I like to do is sew all my strips together, then cut my 4 borders. If that's not the way for you, that's okay. Just, you know, if you want to sew 2 together and go from there, that is perfectly fine. Take what you need from these videos, and the rest use your personal preferences. Okay, so here we are. I've got my borders here, and I'm just going to get them all set on my cutting mat. And in this particular pattern, and to be honest, this is most of my patterns, they tell you to cut your strips at the very beginning under cutting instructions. It tells you to cut your strips, and then it'll tell you to like set these aside for borders for later. So that's kind of the way I usually write most of my patterns that do include borders. But you could always take that selvage off already if you wanted to. And all I'm doing here, just in case you're a new quilter, I'm just kind of lining up my strips with a horizontal line on my mat. Get them all lined up nicely, but I can cut these selvages off. Okay, and I am lining up the lines of my ruler with the lines on my mat, and then I'm going to just cut all this away. It's garbage. All right, and then we're ready to go here. Okay. So I've got my strips, and I've still got them folded, you know, with the manufacturer's fold. And I have the fold here, and I have the cut edges here. All right, I'm just going to do this the same way I sew my binding strips together, which is take this top layer and then just toss it to the side, and then the next 2 layers I sew together. All right, so let me start sewing these. I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch seam. Then I take the next 2, put those together. And I'm going to work my way through this stack of strips. And I think I cut 6, I might have been 8 strips for this quilt. I can't remember now. A whole bunch. This is a very big quilt. I'm working on that 90 by 90 inch size quilt, so the borders are something fierce. I'm just grabbing 2 layers every time. And doing it this way, I found, helps me not get them twisted or tangled or sewn the wrong way. All right, last piece. So here is that last end piece, and that is that. And then we're just going to clip these threads between the chain piecing just to get them separated. All right, and I'm going to take this whole thing to my pressing mat. And again, I want to say that I completely get the fact that sewing them all together like this into one giant strip can be cumbersome, but I feel like it's more batch style versus sewing 2 together or sewing 3 together or whatever it happened to be for your borders. But definitely, again, do it the way you prefer. All right, taking these to the pressing mat. So I have my super long strip, and we are talking super long. And I've got 2 things that I want to press. For one, I still have these manufacturer's folds in there. I want to press those out. And then I want to press all my seams open. So I'm just, this is the exact same way I do binding. So we're just going to move our way along this strip. And I'm going to try to keep it nice down here as much as possible. Like I'm not throwing it off my table or anything like that. Of course, you could throw it off your table if you wanted to. And then I'm just going through this strip and I'm pressing those manufacturer's folds out and I'm pressing the seams open. It's not too time consuming, right? I'm going to grab this whole thing. And what I want to do is kind of keep the 2 ends where I can find them. So there's my other end. I'm just going to hold them and then I'm going to take this whole thing over there to the cutting mat. Here we are. I've still got my 2 ends, and I'm just going to slowly get this in order. All right, so my 2 ends are right here, and I'm trying to get this in order. That's what I'm doing. I'm also trying to line it up on a horizontal line of my mat, but I do have this giant bulk, and there's no other way to do this than just kind of let it fall at the table, and I'm holding on. I got that. And then I'm going to find the fold where they meet at. So let me just work through this. I'm going to try to put them together a little bit. Gravity helps this situation, I think. So I'm cutting 4 borders. I'm cutting 4 borders that are all exactly the same size because we've got those cornerstones going into the corner. So all 4 of these borders, same size, so we can cut them 4 at a time. All right, I have the fold. I'm going to bring the fold back and I'm going to line it up right here where that cut edge is. All right, now I've got 4 layers representing 4 of my borders, and I'm just going to try to get them all lined up nice and neat. And if you are a new quilter, you may not know that every tiny inconsistency adds up into a quilt, into frustration, right? So I don't want to drive myself crazy about it, but I also want to do this as nice and neat and tidy as possible so that I can avoid frustrations. I'm getting it lined up. I'm getting them stacked accurately, which means that all 4 of these layers are touching that horizontal line on my cutting mat. If I had like a super giant cutting mat, this would be so much better. But, we have what we have. All right, so what is on my surface right here is lined up right. I'm cutting 84.5-inch borders, right? My mat is only 36. So I've got to do some maneuvering. Let me get out my little ruler. I like this little ruler for subcutting. All right, little ruler. And I'm going to go ahead and cut off the edge. I'm cutting off this edge to give myself a straight line, but also I'm cutting off that fold so that this is actually going to end up being 4 borders. Line it up. Okay, and then throw this away. All right, so I like to always count in even numbers, and that means all numbers with a 0. Numbers with a 0 are easier to count than, say, a 36. So I'm going to look at the 30 line. My mat is 36 inches. Yours may be smaller. Yours may be bigger. It doesn't matter. It just matters that you go to the next numeral on a 10. So I'm going to go to the 30 because my mat's 36. I don't want to count 6s. I want to count 0s. So I'm at 30. And I'm going to pick up and as accurately as possible. But again, I'm still just eyeballing this. I'm going to pick it up and move the whole thing all the way back down to line 0. Okay, so I hold it there. I'm not going to let this go yet because if I let it go, then I kind of lose my place, and I want to make sure that I get this laid flat before actually letting it go. And if this looks frustrating, It's really not. It might be the first few times you ever do it. After that, it gets to be a second nature to you. But again, this is kind of one of the reasons why I just prefer to make quilts without borders, but can't always be. All right, so I'm lining up all 4 of these layers with a horizontal line on my mat, and we're at 30 inches, and I've got to get to 84 and a half. I'm gonna let this go now that I got it right. And then I'm gonna go to the 30 again, so this will be 60 inches. I'm gonna pinch it again, pick it up, and bring it all the way back to line 0. All right, hold it, and then let's get everything in place. And at the very end of this strip is where all my little inconsistencies are. They've, you know, it's moved. It was hanging off the table, so it's moved everywhere. So it's actually taking me longer to get it sorted on the table, nice and flat, and all the strips perfectly on top of each other. The better you layer these, the more accurate your cuts are going to be. So we're at 60 inches. My ruler, 60. Now I'm going to count on the 10 digits, right? I get to the 10, 70 inches, 80 inches, 84 and a half. I'm going to put my ruler down exactly where I want it. But before I actually cut, I'm going to do it again. 60, 70, 80, 84 and a half. All right, this is excess. And now I have 4 borders measuring 84 and a half inches. And I'm going to put them on my quilt. We're going to walk through that part too, okay? We're going to talk about getting these on the quilt. And pretty much every quilt, I can think of a few instances where this isn't true, but for the majority of quilts, they go on side, side, top, bottom. So I'll do my sides first, and then I'll do my top and bottom. All right, so 2 of these I'm going to set aside for the top and bottom, and I'm just going to focus on my sides. And then these 2, the top and bottom, will also get those cornerstones sewn to it. All right, so put those aside. This part is so much easier if you mark your borders, if you mark the very center, because this is a long piece. And if you just start at one side and you just start pinning it, every single time I've ever done it, even with accurate cutting, piecing, all that, every time I've done it, you always end up with more border to quilt top. So a good idea is to fold your borders in half. All right, fold them in half. And then we're going to go to the pressing mat. All right, I got it folded. Grab your iron. And that will give myself a little mark, a little crease that I'll know is the very center of my quilt, which will help me line it up a little bit easier. So I'm going to do that for that other strip too. All right, get it folded in half. Uh-oh, I got it twisted. Press yourself a little crease, right? I did the same thing with the sashing. So that's another thing. We're not talking about sashing in this video, but this quilt actually has all this sashing. I pressed every single sashing, and that way I could line it up with these center blocks. It just gives yourself a guide, and it just kind of makes putting borders, sashing, all that stuff on a little easier. All right, I'm going to put all my tools away because I don't need them. And I'm going to put this in the scrap bin. Okay, we are ready. All right, and I'm going to grab the quilt from the wall, and I'm making sure, you know, I'm grabbing that left side first. All right, and then here is the very center of my quilt. So I'm going to take this border, and I'm going to find that center line. It's right here. It ended up right on a seam. That's okay though. And this is where we're going to start our pinning. Definitely want to pin borders. All right, so there is, you can see that seam right. Obviously, don't get confused with that seam. We're looking for my little crease line. Found the crease line. I'm going to line it up with the very center part of my quilt. And I'm eyeballing this center. Sometimes you have a seam that you can use, like if this was the center, this seam right here. Sometimes you could use that as your guide for the quilt top. But for this one, I've just got, you know, this cornerstone right here. So I'm going to line them up and pin it right there. All right, so now that I've got the center pinned, I can come over here and pin this edge. So I'm going to pin my 2 edges together. So when I pull the quilt a little taut, you can see that this border is going to fit better. I like to start in the middle, so I'm just going to kind of start pinning. And then if I need to give it a little tug, I give it a little tug. I like to go into the middle that's not pinned and start pinning first. And then when you've got your quilt out like this, you can really see where some of your inconsistencies are. So I can see that, some of these pieces ended up a little bit longer, but I just want you to see that, I've been quilting for a really long time, and this still happens to me. So if it's happening to you, don't stress over it. It's just, a part of the work. I usually try to line up everything with whatever the majority is. So if the majority is short like this, I would use this. If the majority is the longer, I would use the longer piece. And that kind of is what we call fudging the seams, where they're not 100% perfect in there, but it all gets hidden inside the quilt, so it doesn't really matter. All right, so let's slide ourselves down to the other end and complete this. And on this one, I'm going to pin the end first because we've already got the center. And the tighter I pull my quilt top, you can see everything kind of slip right into place. All right, looking good. I would say that more pins are better than less pins. So use how many pins you want to, but I would think more is going to be better. I think I didn't get this side pressed quite as well because I'm seeing some wobbles. And if you're seeing tiny little, well, you can't see it when I raise it up, but if you notice little wobbles like this, put more pins in it, because it means that it doesn't quite fit. But there's this thing in sewing called easing where it can look like it fit. I think my border was just a smidgen big, so something was off somewhere. But the more pins I put in here, the better. All right, now that I have it pinned, I'm just gonna accordion it the best I can. So I can take it all. This is such a big quilt, and it's so hard. It's so hard to get this one, to maneuver this one around. All right, so I'm gonna go and sew this border with a 1/4 inch seam. Before I start pressing that border, I just want to set the seam. And I like to do this on every part of sewing patchwork, but I particularly like it on borders. Normally you're pressing your borders, the border seams, to the borders most of the time, but there's a couple of times you might not. But I'm just going to go ahead and set this seam before I start pressing that in the direction of whatever pattern you're working on calls for. This corrects any kind of sewing tension, or any kind of light sewing tension, I should say. It does add time, but it's not that much time, right? I mean, it just makes it easier. It fixes that tension, and it also just makes it easier to get the seam going in the direction that you want it to go in without, the fuss. One major thing here is you don't want to run your iron over your patchwork. I'm picking it up and lifting it, even when it doesn't look like it sometimes. Sometimes I rewatch these videos and it doesn't look like I'm doing that, but I am doing it, every time. All right, and now we'll just push like that. Push the seam in the direction your pattern tells you to. For me, it's to my borders. I like to smooth it out with my fingers because I feel like the iron can really damage or make your borders wobbly. So I like to do it with my hands first and then bring in the iron. So that the iron isn't the one that's actually doing the pushing. If you want to bring in pressing spray for this task, you can. I don't usually bring it into a border. I've already, got pressing spray when I cut it, so I don't usually bring it into this step. All right, and then I'm just gonna keep going My hands first, then my iron. If you do find that you're getting a wobbly border, even if you're taking all these precautions, a lot of times your quilter can quilt that out, but it always makes me paranoid. So I try to, you know, fix it to begin with, or make it right the first go around. All right, so I think this border looks pretty good. All right. Okay, so I'm going to walk through those exact same steps, but the border on the right side of the quilt. So let me get done with that, and then we'll do top and bottom together. Okay, so we're at the top and the bottom of these borders now. And I've got these cornerstones, but before I sew those cornerstones on, I'm just going to do the same thing I did to these borders, which was fold them in half and press myself a crease to use as my guide. So let me do that. Okay, so I'm going to go and sew my cornerstones onto each end of these borders. I want to make sure that I'm sewing them on in the right direction. So this border has seams. A lot of borders are going to have a seam. So just kind of double check that you're putting these with the border the right side up. So right sides together. I'm going to do that, and then we'll pin them again together. All right, so on this quilt, I'm meant to press my seams to my borders. So I'm setting these seams, and then I'm going to do exactly that. Press to the border. And the good thing about these cornerstone seams is that I'm going to have yet another place to use as a guide for pinning and sewing these borders onto my quilt. So grabbing those borders, and I do want to do the same thing. I want to start with the crease that I pressed in the middle, and that's the part that I want to eyeball, you know, for the middle of my quilt. Here's the very middle of my quilt, and I'm going to line that crease up and then put a pin in it. All right, and then I'm going to move myself down here, and here is our seam for our border. Make sure this isn't twisted, and then we can line up these seams right here. They'll nest together. So get those nested. All right, and then the ends will just fall into place. And my quilt is falling off the table, so I am struggling a little bit here, but let me get it higher up. Okay, so here we go. Same thing we did before. I'm just going to pin every couple of inches. I like to pin those centers first and then work my way to the spreading pins. And you see me doing this a lot. This is just me, you know, moving that edge of the fabric to make it flush with the edge of the quilt top. And I'm just, if I have anything the wrong size, like all of my cornerstones were just, I don't know if you can see this in the video, but all of my cornerstones on the sashing were just a little bit too long. So, I mean, it's less than a 1/4 inch. It is like microscopic, but they are all popping out a little bit. And I'm just kind of using the rest of the quilt as a guide, and then this will just get fudged in the seam allowance, and you won't ever even know that I had that tiny little issue. And now we have this same border seam. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to nest those seams together where the cornerstone meets the left or the right border, and put a pin directly in our stitch line, and the ends will line up, and then we can do the rest of this quilt. Okay, all pinned, and we're going to accordion this again, or whatever works best for you. This is always what works best for me, and that way I don't get stuck with any of those pins. I'm going to go sew this on. I'm going to do the next border the exact same way that I've already shown you, and I'm going to get this quilt completed all the way. I did the top border, I'm going to do the bottom border, and then I'll show it to you when it's all done. Okay, I have finished, and I'm not going to be able to hold this giant 90-inch quilt up for you, and I am very much dreading basting it, but I do want to quilt it. So my borders are on. Here's a little look at that. It could probably use with a little bit more pressing, but we're done. We're done with it, and that's how you do a border. So that may be different how you've done borders in the past, or you may be a pro at borders. You may be putting them on every single quilt. I'd love to know if you have any additional tips and tricks. Please put those in the comments. If you have any questions, let me know that. Not much to it once you get the hang of it, but it is more work than just a block-based quilt. So there's that to think about. One thing that I think is really good about borders is that you can quilt them really prettily. It just provides an extra space for quilting. Also, one more thing I like about them is that you don't end up having any points or seams at your binding. So that's another thing that they might be a bonus about borders. All right, so this again is Honey Pie Quilt. If you don't have a copy of that pattern, I'm going to link to it below. And thanks for watching this video. I will see you next time.